Imaginen un futuro donde las enfermedades se curan en días, la energía es limpia y abundante, y la inteligencia artificial nos revela los secretos más profundos del universo, desde los agujeros negros hasta la estructura fundamental de la realidad. En este episodio, la renombrada matemática y comunicadora Hannah Free conversa con Demis Hassabis, el cerebro detrás de DeepMind, sobre el futuro de la inteligencia artificial y su potencial para transformar la humanidad. Juntos exploran temas tan fascinantes como la posibilidad de descubrir nuevos fenómenos físicos, los desafíos éticos en el desarrollo de AI y los dilemas que enfrentaríamos en una era de abundancia. ¿Será posible alcanzar una IA tan avanzada que nos enseñe conceptos que aún ni imaginamos? ¿Cómo evitamos los riesgos mientras permitimos que esta tecnología nos eleve? Analizamos el impacto que estos avances tendrán en nuestras vidas y hacia dónde podría llevarnos la IA en las próximas décadas.
Welcome to Google DeepMind, the podcast, with me, your host, Professor Hannah Fry. Now, when we first started thinking about making this podcast, way back in 2017, DeepMind was this relatively small, focused AI research lab. They'd just been bought by Google and given the freedom to do their own quirky research projects from the safe distance of London. Well, how things have changed. Because since the last season, Google has reconfigured its entire structure, putting AI and the team at DeepMind at the core of its strategy. Google DeepMind has continued its quest to endow AI with human-level intelligence, known as artificial general intelligence, or AGI. It has introduced a family of powerful new AI models called Gemini, as well as an AI agent called Project Astra that can process audio, video, image, and code. The lab is also making huge leaps in applying AI to a host of scientific domains, including a brand new third version of AlphaFold, which can predict the structures of all of the molecules that you will find in the human body, not just proteins. And in 2021, they spun off a new company, Isomorphic Labs, to get down to the business of discovering new drugs to treat diseases. Google DeepMind is also working on powerful AI agents that can learn to perform tasks by themselves using reinforcement learning and continuing that legacy of AlphaGo's famous victory over a human in the game of Go. Now, of course, you'll all have been following this podcast since the beginning. You'll all be familiar with the stories behind all of those changes. But just in case you are coming to us fresh, welcome. You can find our first award-winning previous seasons on Google DeepMind's YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcasts. Those episodes go into detail about a lot of the themes that we're going to hear come up over and over again from the people here, like reinforcement learning, deep learning, large language models, and so on. So have a listen. They are really good, even if we do say so ourselves. Now, all of the newfound attention on AI since the last series does mean that there are quite a few more podcasts out there for you to choose from. But on this podcast, in just the same way as we always have, we want to offer you something a little bit different. We want to take you right to the heart of where these ideas are coming from, to introduce you to the people who are leading the design of our collective future. No hype, no spin, just compelling discussions and grand scientific ambition. So with all of that in mind, I am here with the DeepMind co-founder and now CEO of Google DeepMind, Demis Hassabis. So with all of that in mind,
yes.
Do I have to call you Sir Demis now?
No, you don't. No, absolutely not.
Okay, well, Demis, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here. Okay, I want to know, is your job easier or harder now that there has been this explosion in public interest?
I think it's double-edged, right? I think it's harder because there's just so much scrutiny, focus, and actually quite a lot of noise in the whole field. I actually preferred it when it was less people and maybe a little bit more focused on the science. But it's also good because it shows that the technology is ready to impact the real world in many different, ways and impact people's everyday lives in positive ways. So I think it's exciting too.
Hey, have you been surprised by how quickly this has caught the public's imagination? I mean, I guess you would have expected that eventually people would have got on board.
Yes, exactly. So at some point, those of us who've been working on it for many years now, even decades. So I guess at some point, the general public would wake up to that fact, and effectively everyone's starting to realize how important AI is going to be. But it's been quite surreal still to see that actually come to fruition and for that to happen. And I guess it is the advent of the chatbots and language models, because everyone, of course, uses language. Everyone can understand language. So it's an easy way for the general public to understand and maybe measure where AI has got to.
I heard you describe these chatbots as though they were unreasonably effective, which I really like.
En Google DeepMind, la profesora Hannah Free discute la evolución de DeepMind desde un pequeño laboratorio de investigación en 2017, tras ser adquirido por Google, hasta su integración en el centro de la estrategia de IA de la compañía. DeepMind ha avanzado en su misión de alcanzar la AGI, con innovaciones como la familia de modelos de IA Gemini y el agente Project Astra, capaz de procesar múltiples tipos de datos. También ha desarrollado AlphaFold 3, que predice estructuras moleculares más allá de las proteínas. La conversación con Demis Hassabis, cofundador y actual CEO de Google DeepMind, destaca el impacto del crecimiento del interés público en la IA, el reto del escrutinio y la influencia de tecnologías como los chatbots en la comprensión pública de la IA.
And actually, later in the podcast, we are going to be discussing Transformers, which was the big breakthrough, I guess, the big advance that gave us those tools. But tell me first, what do you mean by unreasonably effective?
What I mean by it is, I suppose if one were to wind back 5-10 years ago, and you were to say the way we're gonna go about this is, build these amazing architectures and then scale from there, and not necessarily crack specific things like concepts or abstractions. So these are a lot of debates we would have 5-10 years ago. Is do you need a special way of doing abstractions? The brain certainly seems to do that, but yet somehow the systems, if you give them enough data, i.e. the whole internet, then they do seem to learn this and generalize from those examples, not just rote memorize, but actually somewhat understand what they're processing. And it's sort of a little bit unreasonably effective in the sense that, I don't think anyone would have thought that it would work as well as it has done, say 5 years ago.
Yeah. I suppose it is a surprise that things like conceptual understanding and abstraction have emerged rather than been
Yes, and we would have been, probably we discussed last time, things like concepts and grounding, grounding language in real-world experience, maybe in simulations or as robots, embodied intelligence, would have been necessary to really understand the world around us. And of course, these systems are not there yet. They make lots of mistakes. They don't really have a model of the world, a proper model of the world, but they've got a lot further than one might expect just by learning from language.
I guess we probably should actually say what grounding is for those who haven't listened to Series 1 and Series 2.
Sure.
Because this was a big thing. I mean, we were talking about this a lot, about how you need... So do you want to just give us an overview of what grounding is?
So grounding is when... there was one of the reasons the systems that were built in the 80s and 90s, the classical AI systems built at places like MIT, they were big logic systems. So you could imagine them as huge databases of words connected to other words. And the problem was you could say something, a dog has legs, right? And that would be in the database. But the problem was as soon as you showed it a picture of a dog, it had no idea that collection of pixels was referring to that symbol. And that's the grounding problem. So you have this symbolic representation, this abstract representation, but what does it really mean in the real world, in the messy real world? And then, of course, they try to fix that, but you never get that quite right. And instead of that, of course, today's systems, they're directly learning from the data. So in a way, they're forming that connection from the beginning. But the interesting thing is that, if you learn just from language, in theory, there should be missing a lot of the grounding that you need. But it turns out that a lot of it is inferable somehow.
Why in theory?
Well, because where is that grounding coming from? These systems, at least the first kind of large language models,
don't exist in the real world.
They're not connected to simulators. They're not connected to robots. They don't have any access to even. They weren't multimodal to begin with either. They don't have access to the visuals or anything else. It's just purely they live in language space. So they're learning in an abstract domain. So it's pretty surprising they can then infer some things about the real world from that.
Which makes sense if the grounding gets in by people interacting with this system and saying, that's a rubbish answer, that's a good answer.
So for sure, part of that, if the question that they're getting wrong, the early versions of this was due to grounding missing, actually the real world dogs bark in this way or whatever it is, and it's answering it incorrectly, then that feedback will correct it. And part of that feedback is from our own grounded knowledge. So some grounding is seeping in like that for sure.
I remember seeing a really nice example about crossing the English Channel versus walking across the English Channel, right?
Exactly, those kinds of things. And if it answered wrong, you would tell it it's wrong, and then it would have to sort of slightly figure out that you can't walk across the channel.
Demis Hassabis explica la sorprendente eficacia de los modelos de IA, particularmente los basados en transformadores. Hace 5 a 10 años, pocos imaginarían que construir arquitecturas avanzadas y escalarlas usando vastas cantidades de datos, como toda la información de Internet, permitiría a la IA aprender y generalizar conceptos de forma efectiva, sin una programación explícita de abstracciones. Aunque estos sistemas todavía carecen de un modelo robusto del mundo y cometen errores, logran inferir cierta comprensión a partir de datos de lenguaje, algo inesperado dada su falta de conexión con el mundo físico o simuladores. El problema de grounding o anclaje, discutido ampliamente en la IA clásica, se refiere a cómo los sistemas simbólicos pueden representar conceptos abstractos sin entender su correspondencia real. En contraste, los modelos actuales, aunque inicialmente solo operaban en el espacio del lenguaje, han mostrado una capacidad notable para deducir aspectos del mundo real, ayudados por retroalimentación humana que corrige respuestas incorrectas.
Okay, so some of these properties that have emerged that weren't necessarily expected to be, I kind of want to ask you a little bit about hype. Do you think that where we are right now, how things are at this moment, is overhyped or underhyped, or is it just hyped perhaps in the wrong direction?
Yeah, I think it's more the latter. So I would say that in the near term, it's hyped too much. So I think people are claiming it can do all sorts of things it can't. There's all sorts of, startups and VC money chasing crazy ideas that don't, they're just not ready. On the other hand, I think it's still
coming
underhyped.
From you, Demis.
Yes, I know.
But AI in 2010.
Exactly. But I think it's still underhyped or perhaps underappreciated still, even now, what's going to happen when we get to AGI and post-AGI. I still don't feel like that's people have quite understood how enormous that's going to be, and therefore the sort of responsibility of that. So it's sort of both, really. I think it's a little bit overhyped in the near term at the moment. We're kind of going through that cycle.
I guess, though, okay, so in terms of all of these potential startups and VC funding and so on, you, who have lived and breathed this stuff for as you say, decades, are very well placed to spot which ones are realistic goals and which ones aren't. But for other people, how can they distinguish between what's real and what isn't?
Yeah, well, look, I think you need to look at... Obviously, you've got to do your technical due diligence, have some understanding of the technology and the latest sort of trends. I think also look at perhaps the background of the people saying it, how technical they are. Have they just arrived in AI like last year from somewhere else? I don't know. They were doing crypto last year. These might be some clues that perhaps they're jumping on a bandwagon. And it doesn't mean to say, of course, they could still have some good ideas, and many will do. But it's a bit more lottery ticket-like, shall we say? And I think that's always happens when there's a ton of attention suddenly on a place, and obviously then the money follows that, and everyone feels like they're missing out, and that creates a kind of opportunistic, shall we say, environment, which is a little bit opposite to those of us who've been in for decades in a kind of deep technology, deep science way, which is ideally the way I think we need to carry on going as we get closer to AGI.
Demis Hassabis aborda la percepción actual de la IA y su posible exageración. Explica que, a corto plazo, la IA está sobrevalorada, ya que muchas afirmaciones sobre lo que puede hacer son inexactas, impulsadas por startups y capital de riesgo persiguiendo ideas poco maduras. Sin embargo, también considera que la IA está subestimada en cuanto a su impacto futuro, especialmente al acercarse a la AGI y a lo que podría significar en la era post-AGI, una realidad que pocos comprenden plenamente. Hassabis aconseja evaluar la credibilidad de las innovaciones considerando la experiencia técnica de sus proponentes y la profundidad de su implicación en el campo. Observa que la atención y el capital desatan un ambiente oportunista, contrastando con la dedicación de quienes han trabajado por décadas en desarrollos científicos profundos, enfoque que considera crucial para el avance hacia la AGI.
One of the big things we're going to talk about in this series is Gemini,
yes.
which really comes from that very deep science approach, I guess.
Yeah.
In what ways is Gemini different from the other large language models that are released by other labs?
So from the beginning with Gemini, we wanted it to be multimodal from the start. So it could, process not just language, but also audio, video, image, code, any modality really. And the reason we wanted to do that was, firstly, we think that's the way to get these systems to actually understand the world around them and build better world models. So actually still going back to our grounding question earlier, still building grounding in, but piggybacking on top of language this time. And so that's important. And we also had this vision in the end of having a universal assistant, and we prototyped something called Astra, which I'm sure we'll talk about, which understands not just what you're typing, but actually the context you're in. And if you think about something like a personal assistant or digital assistant, it will be much more useful if the more context it understood about what you're asking it for or the situation that you're in. So we always thought that would be a much more useful type of system. And so we built multimodality in from the start. So that was one thing, natively multimodal. And then at the time, that was the only model doing that. So now the other models are trying to catch up. And then the other big innovations we had are on memory, so like long context. So actually holding in mind, 1 million or 2 million now tokens, you can think of them as more or less like words in mind. So you can, give it War and Peace or even a whole, because it's multimodal, a whole video now, a whole film and or a lecture, and then get it to answer questions or find you things within that video stream.
Okay, and Project Astra, that's the new universal AI agent, the one that can take in video and audio data. At Google I/O, I think you used the example of how Astra could help you remember where you left your glasses, for instance. So I wonder, though, about the lineage of this stuff, because is this just a kind of fancy, advanced version of those old Google glasses?
Of course, Google have a long history of developing glass-type devices, actually back to, I think, 2012 or something. So they were way ahead of the curve. But maybe it was just missing this kind of technology. So you could actually understand a smart agent, a smart assistant that could actually understand what it's seeing. And so we're very excited about that digital assistant to go around with you and understand the world around you. So it seems like a really, when you use it, it feels like a really natural use case.
Okay, I want to rewind a tiny bit to sort of the start of Gemini, because it came from two separate parts of the organisation.
Yeah, so we actually last year we combined our two research divisions at Alphabet. So obviously the old DeepMind and then Brain, Google Brain, into one. We call it a super unit, bringing all the talent together that amazing talent we have across the company, across the whole of Google, into one unified unit. And what it meant is that we combined all the best knowledge that we had from all the research we were doing, but especially on language models. So we had Chinchilla and Gopher and things like that, and they were building things like Palm and Lambda and early language models. And they had different strengths and weaknesses, and we pulled them all together into what became Gemini as the first lighthouse project that the combined group would output. And then the other important thing is, of course, was bringing together all the compute as well, so that we could do these really massive training runs and actually pull the compute resources together. So it's been great.
In a lot of ways, I mean, the focus of Google Brain and DeepMind was slightly different.
Yes.
Is that fair to say?
Yeah. So I think it was. I mean, we were obviously focused on both of us on the frontiers of AI, and there was a lot of collaborations already on a kind of individual researcher level, but maybe not on a strategic level. Obviously now, the combined group, Google DeepMind, I kind of describe it as we're like the engine room of Google now. But it's worked really well. I think there were a lot more similarities actually in the way we were working than there were differences. And we've continued to keep and double down our strengths on things like fundamental research. So, where does the next transformer architecture come from? We want to invent that. Obviously, Google Brain invented the previous one. We combine it with deep reinforcement learning that we pioneered. And I still think more innovations are going to be needed, and I would back us to do that, just as we've done in the past 10 years, collectively, both Brain and DeepMind. So it's been exciting.
La integración de DeepMind y Google Brain en el desarrollo de Gemini refleja un enfoque técnico robusto y ambicioso en la evolución de modelos de IA multimodales. Gemini no solo hereda la capacidad de procesar múltiples tipos de datos, sino que también mejora el anclaje en el mundo real, superando limitaciones de modelos previos que se enfocaban solo en texto. con innovaciones en memoria que permiten manejar contextos extensos de hasta 2 millones de tokens. Gemini y su agente asociado, Astra, se posicionan como avances significativos hacia asistentes más que textuales y útiles. Esta fusión de capacidades y recursos, sumada a la experiencia en transformadores y aprendizaje por refuerzo, subraya un camino claro hacia la AGI, mostrando cómo la unificación de esfuerzos en investigación y recursos computacionales potencia la innovación en IA.
I want to come back to that merge in a moment.
Yeah.
But I think just sticking on Gemini for a second, how good is it? How does it compare to other models?
Yeah, well, I think it's, some of the benchmarks are not, the problem is that we need more, I think this is one thing the whole field needs is much better benchmarks.
Yeah,
benchmarks
how do you
for
decide?
Capabilities. Well, there are some well-known benchmarks, academic ones, but they're kind of getting saturated now and they don't really differentiate between the nuances between the different top models. I would say there's sort of three models that are kind of at the top of the frontier. So it's Gemini from us, OpenAI's GPT, of course, and then Anthropic with their Claude models. And then obviously there's a bunch of other good models too that, people like Meta and Mistral and others build. And they're differently good at different things. It depends what you want. Coding, perhaps that's Claude, and reasoning, maybe that's GPT, and then memory stuff, long context and multimodal understanding, that would be Gemini. Of course, we're continuing to, all of us are improving our models all the time. So, given where we started from, which Gemini as a project only existed for a year, obviously based on some of our other projects, I think our trajectory is very good. So, when we talk next time, we should, hopefully be, right at the forefront.
Because there is still a way to go. I mean, there are still some things that these models aren't very good at.
Yes, for sure. And actually, that's the big debate right now. So this last set of things kind of emerged from the technologies that were, invented 5-6 years ago. The question is they're still missing a ton of things. So the factuality, they hallucinate, as we know. They're also not good at planning yet. They're
planning in what sense? I mean,
well, like kind of long-term planning. So they can't problem solve something long-term. You give it an objective. They can't really do actions in the world for you. So they're very much like passive Q&A systems. You put the energy in by asking the question and then they give you some kind of response. But they're not able to solve a problem for you. You can't say something like, if you wanted it as a digital assistant, you might want to say something like, book me that holiday in Italy and all the restaurants and the museums and whatever, and it knows what you like. But then it goes out and books the flights and all of that for you. So it can't do any of that. But I think that's the next era. These sort of more agent-based systems, we would call them, or agentic systems that have agent-like behavior. But of course, that's what we're expert in. That's what we used to build with all our game agents, AlphaGo, and all of the other things we've talked about in the past. So a lot of what we're doing is bringing to kind of marrying that work that we're sort of, I guess, famous for, and then with the new large multimodal models. And I think that's going to be, the next generation of systems. You can think of it as combining AlphaGo with Gemini.
Yeah, because I guess AlphaGo was very, very good at planning.
Yes, it was very good at planning. Of course, only in the domain, though, of games. And so we need to sort of generalize that into the general domain of everyday workloads and language.
Gemini destaca en el panorama de modelos de IA al incorporar capacidades multimodales avanzadas y un enfoque hacia la comprensión y memoria de contextos largos, superando en ciertas áreas a competidores como GPT de OpenAI y Claude de Anthropic. Sin embargo, Demis Hassabis subraya que aún hay limitaciones, especialmente en la planificación a largo plazo y en la capacidad de actuar proactivamente para resolver problemas complejos, algo que los modelos actuales todavía no dominan. El siguiente paso evolutivo, según Hassabis, es integrar estos modelos avanzados con sistemas agénticos, basándose en la experiencia de DeepMind con agentes como AlphaGo, lo cual podría transformar las capacidades de los modelos en asistentes autónomos más funcionales y eficientes.
You mentioned a minute ago how Google DeepMind is now sort of the engine room of Google. I mean, that is quite a big shift since I was asked here the last couple of years ago.
Yeah.
Is Google taking quite a big gamble on you?
Yeah, well, I guess so. I mean, I think Google have always understood the importance of AI. Sundar, when he took over as CEO, said that Google was an AI-first company, and we discussed that very early on in his tenure, and he saw the potential in AI as the next big paradigm shift after mobile and internet, but bigger than those things. But then I think maybe in the last year or two, we've really started living what that means, not just from a research perspective, but also from products and other things. So It's very exciting, but I think it's the right bet for us to kind of coordinate all of our talents together and then push as hard as possible.
And then how about the other way around? Because I guess from DeepMind having that very strong research and like science focus, does becoming the engine room for Google now mean that you have to care much more about commercial interest rather than the sort of purer stuff that you did before?
Well, we do definitely have to worry more about, and it's in our remit now, the commercial interests. But actually, there's sort of a couple of things to say about that. First of all, we're continuing on with our science work and AlphaFolds, and you just saw AlphaFold 3 come out, and we're doubling down on our investments there. That's, I think, a unique thing that we do at Google DeepMind now. And even our competitors point at those things as sort of universal goods, if you like, that come out of AI. And that's going really well. And we spun out Isomorphic to do drug discovery. So it's very exciting. That's all going really well. And so we're going to continue to do that. And then what was all our work on climate and all of these things. But then we're quite a large team, so we can do more than one thing at once. We're also building our large models, Gemini and et cetera. And then we have a product team that we're building out that is going to bring all this amazing technology to all of the surfaces that Google has. So it's an incredible sort of privilege in a way to have that there to plug in all of our stuff. And, we invent something, it immediately can become useful to 1 billion people. And so that's really motivating. And actually, the other thing is there's less. There's a lot more convergence now between the technology you would need to develop for a product to have AI in it and what you would do for pure AGI research purposes. So there's not really, 5 years ago, you'd have had to build some special case AI for a product. Now you can branch off your main research. And of course, you still need to do some things that are product specific, but maybe it's only 10% of the work. So there's actually not that tension anymore between what you would develop for an AI product and what you would develop for trying to build AGI. It's 90%, I would say, the same research program. So and then finally, of course, if you do products and you get them out into the world, you learn a lot from that. And people using it, and you learn a lot about your internal metrics don't quite match what people are saying. So then you can update that, and that's really helpful for your research.
Absolutely. Well, okay. I mean, we are going to talk a lot more in this podcast about those breakthroughs that have come from applying AI to science. But I want to ask you about that tension that there is between knowing when the right moment is to release something to the public. Because internally at DeepMind, those tools like large language models were being used for research rather than being seen as a potentially commercial thing.
Yeah, that's right. So we're as you know, we've always taken responsibility incredibly seriously here, and safety, right from the beginning, way back when we started in 2010 and before that. And Google then adopted some of our basically ethics charter effectively into their AI principles. So we've always been well aligned with the whole of Google and wanting to be responsible about deploying this as one of the leaders in this space. And so it's been interesting now starting to ship real products with Gen AI in them. Actually, there's a lot of learning that is going on, and we're learning fast, which is good because we're at relatively low stakes here with the current technology, right? So it's not that powerful yet. But as it gets more powerful, we have to be more careful. And that's just learning about the product teams that are, in other groups, learning about how to test Gen AI technologies. It's different from a normal piece of technology because it doesn't always do the same thing. It's almost like testing an open world game. It's almost infinite what you can try and do with it. So it's sort of interesting to figure out how do you do the red teaming on it.
So red teaming in this case being where you're competing against yourselves.
Yeah, so red teaming is when you set up a specific separate team from the team that's developed the technology to stress test it and try and break it in any way possible. You actually need to use tools to automate that, because nobody can red team. Even if you had thousands of people doing it, that's not enough compared to billions of users. When you put it out there, they're going to try all sorts of things. So it's kind of interesting to take that learning and then improve our processes so that our future launches will be as smooth as possible. And I think we got to do it in stages, where there's an experimental phase, then a kind of, there's closed beta, and then launch. A little bit, again, like we used to launch our games back in the day. So you sort of, and learn at each step of the way. So there's, and then the other thing we got to do, and I think we need to do more on, is use AI itself to help us internally with red teaming and actually spotting some errors automatically or triaging that, so that then the human, our kind of developers and human testers can actually focus on those hard cases.
You said something really interesting there about how you're just in a much more probabilistic space here, right? And then if there's even a very small chance of something happening, if you have enough tries, eventually something will go wrong. And I guess there have been a couple of mistakes that, public mistakes.
Yeah, so that's why, I think that, as I mentioned, that product teams are just getting used to the sorts of testing. They tested these things, but they have this stochastic nature, probabilistic nature. So, in fact, a lot of cases where, if it was a normal piece of software, you could say, I've tested 99.999% of things. So then it extrapolates. Yes, and then it's enough because, there's no way of exposing the flaw that it has, if it has one. But that's not the case with these generative systems. They can do all sorts of things that are a little bit left field or out of the box, out of distribution in a way from what you've seen before. If someone clever or adversarial decides to, it's almost like a hacker, decides to push it in some way. And it could even be, it's so combinatorial. It could even be with all the things that you've happened to have said before to it. And then then it's in some kind of peculiar state, which then, or it's got its memories filled up with a particular thing. And then that's why it outputs something. So there's a lot of complexity there. But it's not infinite. So there's ways to deal with it, but it's just a lot more nuanced than launching normal technology.
La integración de Google DeepMind como el motor de Google subraya una evolución estratégica en la que la investigación y la comercialización convergen más que nunca. Demis Hassabis aborda cómo este enfoque permite a DeepMind mantener su liderazgo en investigación avanzada, como AlphaFold, mientras impulsa el desarrollo de productos como Gemini que afectan a miles de millones de usuarios. Aunque la dualidad entre ciencia pura e intereses comerciales ha disminuido gracias a tecnologías que sirven tanto a productos como a la búsqueda de AGI, el proceso de despliegue enfrenta desafíos particulares. La naturaleza probabilística de los sistemas generativos demanda enfoques rigurosos de pruebas, incluyendo red teams automatizados, para mitigar riesgos y adaptar la IA al entorno dinámico del uso real, asegurando su seguridad y efectividad.
I remember you saying, I think it was like in the first time I interviewed you, about how actually you have to think that this is a completely different way of computing. You kind of have to move away from the sort of the things that we completely understand, the deterministic stuff, into this much more messy, like probabilistic, error-ridden place, as well as your testers. Do you think the public slightly has to shift its mindset on the type of computing that we're doing now?
Yeah, I think so, because, and maybe that's something another thing, interestingly, that we're thinking about is actually putting out a kind of principles document or something before you release something to show what is the expectation from this system. What's it designed for? What's it useful for? What can't it do? I think, there is some sort of education there needed of like, you'll be able to find it useful if you do these things with it, but don't try and use it for these other things because it won't work. And I think that's something that we need to get better at clarifying as a field, and then probably users need to get more experienced on. And actually, this is probably why chatbots themselves came a little bit out of the blue, right? Even obviously ChatGPT, but even to OpenAI, it surprised them. And we had our own chatbots and Google had theirs. And one of the things is we were looking at them and we were looking at all the flaws they still had, right? And they still do. And it's like, well, it's getting these things wrong, and it sometimes does, hallucinates and blah, blah, blah. And there's so many things. But then what we didn't realize is actually there's still a lot of very good use cases for that, even now, that people find very valuable, summarizing documents and really long things, or writing, awkward emails or mundane, forms to be filled in. And there's all these use cases which actually people don't mind if there's some small errors, they can fix them easily and saves a huge amount of time. And I guess that was the surprising thing. People discovered when you put it in the hands of everyone, there were actually these valuable use cases, even though the systems were flawed in all of these ways we know.
Demis Hassabis subraya un punto crucial sobre la naturaleza de los sistemas de IA modernos. Operan en un espacio probabilístico, no determinista, lo que requiere un cambio en la forma en que tanto los desarrolladores como los usuarios los perciben y manejan. La introducción de documentos de principios para establecer expectativas claras sobre las capacidades y limitaciones de los modelos es una estrategia clave que podría guiar a los usuarios y mitigar la frustración. Aunque estos sistemas aún tienen errores y pueden alucinar, sorprenden al ofrecer un valor tangible en tareas cotidianas, como resumir textos largos o gestionar comunicaciones tediosas. El éxito inesperado de herramientas como los chatbots muestra que, a pesar de sus imperfecciones, son útiles en contextos prácticos donde pequeños errores son aceptables y fáciles de corregir, resaltando la importancia de ajustar las expectativas y el uso adecuado de la tecnología.
Well, okay, so I think that sort of takes me on to the next question I want to ask, which is about open source. Because when things are in the hands of people, as you mentioned, really extraordinary things can happen. And I know that DeepMind in the past has open sourced lots of its research projects, but it feels like that's slightly changing now as we go forward. Just tell me what your stance is on open source.
Yeah, well, look, we're huge supporters of open source and open science. As you know, we've given away and published almost everything we've done. If you collectively, including like things like Transformers, right? And AlphaGo, we published all these things in Nature and Science. AlphaFold was open source, as we covered last time. And these are all good choices, and you're absolutely right. That's the reason that all works, is because that's the way technology and science advances as quickly as possible, by sharing information. So almost always that's a universal good to do it like that, and that's how science works. The only exception is when AGI and AI, powerful AI, does fall into this, is we have a dual purpose technology, right? And so then the problem is that you want to enable all the good use cases and all the genuine scientists who are acting in good faith and so on, technologists, to build on the ideas, critique the ideas and so on. That's the way, society advances the quickest. But the problem is, how do you restrict access at the same time for bad actors who would take the same systems, repurpose them for bad ends, misuse them, weapon systems, who knows what. And, those general purpose systems can be repurposed like that. And it's okay today, because I don't think the systems are that powerful. But in 2, 3, 4 years' time, especially when you start getting agent-like systems or agentic behaviors, then I think, if something's misused by someone, or perhaps even a rogue nation state, there could be serious harm. So then I think that as I don't have a solution to that, but as a community, we need to think about, what does that mean for open source? Perhaps the frontier models need to have more checks on them, and then only after they've been out for a year or 2 years, then they can get open sourced. That's sort of the model we're following, because we have our own open models of Gemini called Gemma. They're smaller, so they're not frontier models. So usually their capabilities are very useful still to the developer, because they're also easy to run on a laptop, or because they're small numbers of parameters. But the capabilities they have are well understood at this point, right? Because they're not frontier models. So it's just not as powerful as the latest, say, Gemini, 1.5 models. So I think that's probably the approach that we'll end up taking, is we'll have open source models, but they'll be lagging, maybe 1 year behind the most cutting edge models, just so that those models, we can really assess out in the open, by users, what those models can do, the frontier ones can do.
And you can really, I guess, test those boundaries of the stochastic.
And we'll see what those are. The problem with open source is, if something goes wrong, you can't recall it. Right, with a proprietary model, if your bad actor starts using it in a bad way, you can just sort of close the tap off. In the limit, you could switch it off, right? But once you open source something, there's no pulling it back. So it's a one-way door. So you should be very, very sure when you do that.
Is it definitely possible to contain an AGI, though, within the sort of walls of an organisation?
Well, that's a whole separate question. I don't think we know how to do that right now. So that's when you start talking about AGI level powerful, like human level AI.
Or what about intermediary?
Well, intermediary, I think we have good ideas of how to do that. So, one would be things like secure sandboxing. So you test. That's what I'd want to test the agent behaviors is in a game environment, or a version of the internet that's not quite fully connected, right? So there's a lot of security work that's done and known, in this space, in fintech and other places. So we'd probably borrow those ideas and then build those kinds of systems, and that's how we would test the early prototype systems. But we also know that's not going to be good enough to contain an AGI, something that's potentially smarter than us. So I think we've got to understand those systems better so that we can design the protocols for an AGI, when that time comes, we'll have better ideas for how to contain that, potentially also using AI systems and tools to monitor the next versions of the AI system.
Demis Hassabis destaca la importancia de equilibrar la apertura en la investigación de IA con la necesidad de controlar los riesgos asociados a tecnologías de uso dual, especialmente en el contexto de la IA avanzada y los sistemas agénticos. Aunque DeepMind ha compartido abiertamente investigaciones como Transformers y AlphaFold, Hassabis argumenta que los modelos más potentes deben ser manejados con precaución. Propone un enfoque donde los modelos de frontera no se liberan inmediatamente como código abierto, sino después de un periodo de evaluación para mitigar el riesgo de mal uso por actores malintencionados. La naturaleza irreversible de liberar un modelo open source resalta la necesidad de ser extremadamente cautelosos, ya que una vez publicado, es imposible retirarlo. Este enfoque podría implicar una combinación de pruebas en entornos seguros y el uso de herramientas de IA para monitorear y contener futuros desarrollos en AGI.
So on the subject of safety then, because I know that you were a very big part of the AI Safety Summit at Bletchley Park in 2023, which is, of course, hosted by the UK government. And from the outside, I think a lot of people just say the word regulation as though it's just going to come in and fix everything. But what is your view on how regulation should be structured?
Well, I think it's great that governments are getting up to speed on it and involved. I think that's one of the good things about the recent explosion of interest is that, of course, governments are paying attention. And I think it's been great. UK government specifically, who I've talked to a lot, and US as well, they've got very smart people in the civil service staff that are understand the technology now to a good degree. And it's been great to see the AI safety institutes being set up in the UK and US, and I think many other countries are going to follow. So I think these are all good precedents and protocols to settle into, again, before the stakes get really high, right? So this is a sort of proving stage as well. And I do think international cooperation is going to be needed, ideally, around things like regulation and guardrails and deployment norms. So because AI is a digital technology, very much so, it's hard to contain it within national boundaries, right? So if the UK or Europe does something, or even the US, but China doesn't, does that really help the world as opposed, when we start getting closer to AGI? Not really. So I think my view in it is you've got to be, because the technology is changing so fast, we've got to be very nimble and light-footed with regulation so that it's easy to adapt it to where the latest technology is going. If you'd regulated AI 5 years ago, you'd have regulated something completely different to what we see today, which is Gen AI. But it might be different again in 5 years. It might be these agent-based systems that are the ones that carry the highest risk. So right now, I would recommend a sort of beef up existing regulations in domains that already have them, health, transport, so on. I think, you can update them for AI, for an AI world, just like they were updated for mobile and internet. That's probably the first thing I do, while doing a watching brief on, and making sure you understand and test the frontier systems. And then as things become clear and sort of more clearly obvious, then start regulating around that. Maybe in a couple of years' time would make sense. One of the things we're missing is, again, the benchmarks, the right tests for capabilities that what we'd all want to know, including the industry and the field, is at what point are capabilities posing some sort of big risk? And there's no answer to that at the moment, right? Beyond what I've just said, which is agent-based capabilities is probably a next threshold. Yeah. But there's no agreed upon test for that. One thing you might imagine is like testing for deception, for example, as a capability. You really don't want that in the system because then you can't rely on anything else that it's reporting, right? So that would be my number one emergent capability that I think, would be good to test for. But there's many. Ability to achieve certain goals, ability to replicate. And there's quite a lot of work going on this now. And I think the safety institutes, which are basically sort of government agencies, I think they're working. I think it'd be great for them to do a lot, to push on that as well as the labs, of course, contributing what we know.
I wonder, in this picture of the world that you're describing, what's the place for institutions in this? I mean, if we get to the stage where we have AGI that's kind of supporting all scientific research, is there still a place for great institutions?
Yeah, I think so. Look, there's sort of the stage up to AGI, and I think that's got to be a cooperation between civil society, academia, government, and and the industrial labs. So I really believe that's the only way we're going to get to the sort of final stages of this. Now, if you're asking after the AGI happens, that maybe that is what you're asking, then AGI, of course, one of the reasons I've always wanted to build it is then we can use it to start answering some of the biggest, most fundamental questions about the nature of reality and physics and all of these things and consciousness and so on. It depends, what form that takes, whether that will be a human expert combination with AI. I think that will be the case for a while in terms of discovering the next frontier. So like right now, these systems can't come up with their own conjectures or hypotheses. They can help you prove something. And I think we'll be able to prove, get gold medals on International Maths Olympiad, things like that. But or maybe even solve a famous conjecture. I think that's within reach now, but they don't have the ability to come up with Riemann hypothesis in the first place, right? Or general relativity. So that's really was always my test for maybe a true artificial general intelligence, is it will be able to do that or invent Go. And so we don't have any systems. We don't really know how, even probably, know how we would design, in theory, even a system that could do that.
Demis Hassabis subraya la importancia de una regulación ágil y adaptable para la IA, destacando que debe evolucionar en línea con el rápido desarrollo de la tecnología. Mientras que la regulación sólida en sectores ya establecidos, como la salud y el transporte, puede adaptarse para un mundo impulsado por IA, es crucial que los gobiernos, institutos de seguridad y la industria colaboren en la creación de pruebas específicas para medir capacidades potencialmente peligrosas, como la capacidad de engañar o replicarse. Propone que la regulación y los estándares deben ajustarse conforme se comprenda mejor qué umbrales representan riesgos significativos, priorizando enfoques flexibles y cooperación internacional para evitar que el control de la IA quede desbalanceado entre naciones.
The computer scientist Stuart Russell, so he told me that he was a bit worried that once we get to AGI, it might be that we all become like the royal princes of the past, the ones who never had to ascend the throne or do any work, but just got to live this life of unbridled luxury and have no purpose.
Yeah, so that is the interesting question. Is it maybe it's beyond AGI? It's more like artificial superintelligence or something. Sometimes people call it ASI. But then we should have, radical abundance. And assuming we, make sure we distribute that, fairly and equitably, then we will be in this position where, we'll have more freedom to choose what to do. And then meaning will be a big philosophical question. And I think we'll need philosophers, perhaps theologians even, to start thinking as social scientists that they should be thinking about that now. What brings meaning? I mean, I still think there's, of course, self-actualization, and I don't think we'll all just be sitting there meditating, but maybe we'll be playing computer games. I don't know. But is that a bad thing even or not, right? Who knows?
I don't think the princes of the past came off particularly well.
No, traveling the stars. But then there's also, extreme sports people do. Why do they do them? I mean, climb Everest, all these. I mean, they'll be, but I think it's going to be very interesting. And that I don't know. But that's kind of what I was saying earlier about it's underappreciated what's going to happen. Going back to the hype, near term versus far term. So if you want to call that hype even, it's definitely underhyped, I think, the amount of transformation that will happen. I think it will be very good in the limit. We'll cure lots of diseases and all diseases, solve our energy problems, climate problems. But then the next question comes is there meaning?
So bringing us back like slightly closer to AGI rather than superintelligence. I know that your big mission is to build artificial intelligence to benefit everybody.
Yeah.
But how do you make sure that it does benefit everybody? How do you include all people's preferences rather than just the designers?
Yeah, I think I think what's going to have to happen is, it's impossible to include all preferences in one system because by definition, people don't agree, right? We can see that unfortunately in the current state of the world. Countries don't agree, governments don't agree. We can't even get agreement on obvious things like dealing with the climate situation. So I think that's very hard. What I imagine that will happen is that, we'll have a set of safe architectures, hopefully, that personalized AIs can be built on top of. And then everyone will have, or different countries will have their own preferences about what they use it for, what they deploy it for, what what can and can't be done with them. But overall, and that's fine, that's for everyone to individually decide or countries to decide themselves just like they do today. But as a society, we know that there's some provably safe things about those architectures, right? And then you can let them proliferate and so on. So I think that we got to get through the eye of a needle in a way, where we got to, as we get closer to AGI, we've probably got to cooperate more, ideally internationally, and then make sure we build AGIs in a safe architecture way, because I'm sure there are unsafe ways and I'm sure there are safe ways of building AGI. And then once we get through that, then we can sort of open the funnel again and everyone can have their own personalized pocket AGIs. If they want.
What a version of the future.
Yeah.
Okay, but then in terms of the safe way to build it, I mean, are we talking about undesirable behaviors here that might emerge?
Yes, undesirable emergent behaviors, capabilities. The deception is one example that you don't want. Value systems, we got to understand all of these things better. What kind of guardrails work, not circumventable. And there's two cases to worry about. There's bad uses by bad individuals or nations, so human misuse, and then there's the AI itself, right? As it gets closer to AGI, going off the rails. And I think you need different solutions for those two problems. And so, yeah, that's what we're going to have to contend with as we get closer to building these technologies. And also, just going back to your benefiting everyone point, of course, what I'm, we're showing the way with things like AlphaFold and isomorphic. I think we could, cure most diseases within the next decade or two if AI drug design works. And then there could be personalized medicines where it minimizes the side effects on the individual because it's mapped to the person's individual illness and their individual metabolism and so on. So these are kind of amazing things, clean energy, renewable energy sources, fusion or better solar power, all of these types of things. I think they're all within reach. And then that would sort out water access because you could do desalination everywhere. So I just feel like this enormous good is going to come from these technologies, but we have to mitigate the risks too.
Demis Hassabis enfatiza la complejidad de garantizar que la inteligencia artificial beneficie a toda la sociedad, destacando la necesidad de arquitecturas seguras que permitan la personalización según las preferencias de individuos y países. Argumenta que, aunque es imposible satisfacer universalmente todas las preferencias, un enfoque escalonado en el desarrollo de AGI que priorice la cooperación internacional y la construcción de sistemas con salvaguardias probadas es clave. Reconoce dos grandes desafíos: el uso indebido por parte de actores humanos y la posibilidad de que la IA desarrolle comportamientos emergentes no deseados, como la decepción. Subraya que el potencial positivo de la IA, como curas personalizadas y energía limpia, es inmenso, pero que se deben abordar los riesgos de manera proactiva para maximizar su beneficio social.
And one way that you said that you would want to mitigate the risks was that there would be a moment where you would basically do the scientific version of Avengers Assemble.
Yes, sure.
Terence Tao,
yes,
get him on the phone.
Exactly.
Bring him on down.
Yeah, exactly.
Is that still your plan?
Yeah, well, I think so. I think if we can get the international cooperation, I'd love there to be a kind of international CERN, basically, for AI, where you get the top researchers in the world and you go, look, let's focus on the final few years of this AGI project and get it really right and do it scientifically and carefully and thoughtfully at every step, the final sort of steps. I still think that would be the best way.
How do you know when is the time to press the button?
Well, that's the big question, because you can't do it too early because you would never be able to get the buy-in to do that. A lot of people would disagree. I mean, today, people disagree with the risks, right? You see very famous people saying there's no risks, and then you have people like Jeff Hinton saying there's lots of risks, and I'm in the middle of that.
I wanted to talk to you a bit more about neuroscience. How much does it still inspire what you're doing? Because I noticed the other day that DeepMind had unveiled this computerized rat with an artificial brain that helps to change our understanding of how the brain controls movement. But in the first season of the podcast, I remember we talked a lot about how DeepMind takes direct inspiration from biological systems. Is that still the core of your approach?
No, it's evolved now, because I think we've got to a stage now in the last, I would say 2-3 years, we've gone more into an engineering phase, large-scale systems, massive training architectures. So I would say that the influence of neuroscience on that is a little bit less. It may come back in. So anytime where you need more invention, then you want to get as many sources as possible, and neuroscience would be one of those sources of ideas. But when it's more engineering heavy, then I think that takes a little bit more of a backseat. So it may be more applying AI to neuroscience now, like you saw with the virtual rat brain. And I think we'll see that as we get closer to AGI, using that to understand the brain. I think it would be one of the coolest use cases for AGI and science.
I guess this stuff kind of goes through phases of like the engineering challenge, exactly. The intervention challenge.
So it's done its part, it's, for now, and it's been great. And we still obviously keep a close track of it and take any other ideas too.
Okay.
Demis Hassabis propone la creación de una especie de CERN internacional para la IA, donde los principales investigadores del mundo puedan colaborar en las etapas finales del desarrollo de la AGI de manera metódica y científica. Este enfoque busca garantizar que se aborden adecuadamente los riesgos asociados con la inteligencia artificial, un tema que genera debate incluso entre expertos. Si bien Hassabis reconoce que la neurociencia ha influido en la evolución de su trabajo, señala que el enfoque actual se ha desplazado hacia la ingeniería, utilizando arquitecturas de entrenamiento a gran escala. No obstante, sugiere que la neurociencia podría volver a desempeñar un papel importante a medida que se avance en el desarrollo de AGI, ofreciendo oportunidades únicas para la comprensión del cerebro humano a través de aplicaciones de inteligencia artificial.
All of the pictures of the future that you've painted are still anchored quite in reality. But I know that you've said that you really want AGI to be able to peer into the mysteries of the universe down at the Planck scale.
Yes.
Like kind of subatomic quantum worlds.
Yeah.
Do you think that there are things that we have not even yet conceived of that might end up being possible? I'm talking wormholes here.
Completely, yes. I love wormholes to be possible. I think there is a lot of probably misunderstanding, I would say, still things we don't understand about physics and the nature of reality. And obviously the quantum mechanics and unifying that with, gravity and all of these things. And there's all these problems with the standard model. So I think there's and string theory, I just think
there's these giant gaping holes in physics.
In physics all over the place. And if you're, talk to my physics friends about this, and there's a lot of things that don't fit together. I don't really like the multiverse explanation. So I think that it would be great to come up with new theories and then test those on massive apparatus, perhaps out in space, at these tiny, the reason I'm obsessed with Planck scale things, Planck time, Planck space, is because that seems to be the resolution of reality, right? That in a way, that's the kind of smallest quanta you can break anything into. So that feels like the kind of level you want to experiment on if you had powerful apparatus perhaps designed or enabled by having AGI and radical abundance. You need both. So to be able to afford to build those types of experiments.
The resolution of reality.
Yeah.
What a phrase.
Yeah.
So is in like the resolution that we're at the moment, sort of human level, is just an approximation of reality.
Yes, that's right. And then we know there's the atomic level, and below that's the Planck level, which as far as we know is the smallest resolution one can even talk about things. And so that, to me, would be the resolution one wants to experiment on to really understand what's going on here.
I wonder whether you're also envisaging that there'll be things that are beyond the limits of human understanding. AGI will help us to uncover that actually we're just not really capable of understanding. And then I sort of wonder if things are unexplainable or ununderstandable, are they still falsifiable?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, these are great questions. I think there will be a potential for an AGI system to understand higher level abstractions than we can. So going back to neuroscience, we know that, it's your prefrontal cortex that does that. And there's sort of up to about 6 or 7 layers of indirection, one could take. This person's thinking this and I'm thinking this about that person thinking this and so on. And then we sort of lose track. But I think an AI system could have an arbitrarily sort of large prefrontal cortex effectively. So you could imagine higher levels of abstraction and patterns that it will be able to see about the universe that we can't really comprehend or hold in mind at once. And then I think in terms of explainability point of view, the way I think that is a little bit different to other philosophers who've thought about this, which is like we'll be like closer to an ant and then the AGI, right, in terms of IQ. But I don't think that's the way to think of it. I think, we are Turing complete. So we're sort of a full general intelligence as ourselves, albeit a bit slow because we run on slow machinery and we can't, infinitely expand our own brains. But we can, in theory, given enough time and memory, understand anything. that's computable. And so I think it will be more like Gary Kasparov or Magnus Carlsen playing an amazing chess move. I couldn't have come up with it, but they can explain it to me why it's a good move. So I think that's what an AGI system will be able to do.
You said that DeepMind was a 20-year project.
Yeah.
How far through are we? Are you on track?
I think we're on track, yeah, crazily, because usually 20-year projects stay 20 years away.
Yeah.
But we're a good way in now, and I think we're still
20 years is 2030 for
2030,
AGI.
yeah. So I think the way I say is I wouldn't be surprised if it comes in the next decade. So I think we're on track.
That matches what you said last time. You haven't updated your priors.
Exactly.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Demis Hassabis postula que la inteligencia artificial general, AGI, tiene el potencial de descubrir aspectos de la realidad que aún no hemos concebido, sugiriendo que el entendimiento humano es solo una aproximación limitada. Enfatiza la importancia de explorar la escala de Planck, la unidad más pequeña de medida en física, como un medio para abordar las incógnitas fundamentales del universo, y sugiere que experimentos avanzados en este nivel podrían ser viables con el apoyo de AGI y recursos abundantes. Hassabis también plantea que AGI podría captar patrones y abstracciones en el universo que son inalcanzables para la mente humana, permitiendo una comprensión más profunda de fenómenos complejos. Destaca que, aunque AGI podría operar a niveles de inteligencia mucho más allá de los nuestros, su capacidad para explicar sus hallazgos podría ser comparable a la de un gran maestro ajedrecista, capaz de detallar sus movimientos aunque sus estrategias sean incomprensibles para un jugador promedio.
Thank you so much. Absolute delight. Absolute delight as always.
So fun to talk as always. Well, thank you.
Okay, I think there are a few really important things that came out of that conversation, especially when you compare it to what Demis was saying last time we spoke to him in 2022, because there have definitely been a few surprises in the last couple of years. The way that these models have demonstrated a genuine conceptual understanding is one. This real-world grounding that came in from language and human feedback alone. We did not think that would be enough. And then how interesting and useful imperfect AI has been to the everyday person. Demis himself there admitted that he had not seen that one coming. And that makes me wonder about the other challenges that we don't yet know how to solve, like long-term planning and agency and robust, unbreakable safeguards. How many of those, which we're going to cover in detail in this podcast, by the way, are we going to come back to in a couple of years and realise that they were easier than we thought? And how many of them are going to be harder? And then as for the big predictions that Demis made, like cures for most diseases or in 10 or 20 years, or AGI by the end of the decade, or how we're about to enter into an era of abundance, I mean, they all sound like Demis is being a bit overly optimistic, doesn't it?
Hannah Free reflexiona sobre las sorprendentes revelaciones de Demis Hassabis respecto al avance de la inteligencia artificial, especialmente en su capacidad para demostrar comprensión conceptual a través de modelos de lenguaje y retroalimentación humana, algo que inicialmente no se consideraba suficiente. Este cambio de paradigma resalta la posibilidad de que algunos de los desafíos futuros, como la planificación a largo plazo, la agencia y la implementación de salvaguardias robustas, podrían resultar más manejables de lo anticipado. Free cuestiona si las predicciones optimistas de Hassabis, como la cura de enfermedades y la llegada de la AGI para finales de la década, son realistas o demasiado optimistas, aunque reconoce que su historial de aciertos hasta ahora invita a la reflexión. Esto sugiere que, a medida que el campo de la IA avanza, las expectativas y desafíos podrían evolucionar, y lo que hoy parece inalcanzable podría convertirse en un logro realizable más pronto de lo que se piensa. Dada la rápida evolución de la inteligencia artificial y las afirmaciones optimistas sobre su potencial para resolver desafíos complejos y mejorar nuestra calidad de vida, ¿qué aspectos creen que deberían ser priorizados para garantizar que el desarrollo de la AGI beneficie a toda la sociedad, y cuáles consideran los mayores riesgos que debemos mitigar en este proceso? Mejor mira este vídeo de revolución en IA con los modelos de fundación líquida. Si has llegado hasta aquí en el vídeo, quiero darte las gracias, déjame saber lo que piensas en los comentarios, dale like, suscríbete y no olvides activar la campanita para no perderte ninguno de nuestros vídeos, no te cuesta nada y nos ayudas un montón. Esto es IA Avanzada y nos vemos en el siguiente.